Last Monday marked the 75th anniversary of the Partition of India in 1947, the process by which the old British Raj was transformed into several new and independent states, which today can be divided into Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. Back then, there were several more states that were created, although eventually we ended up with only 3 states, and it's largely said that the reason why this division occurred was because of religious differences, that Pakistan, East and West as it was then, would be majority Muslim states, whilst India would be a majority Hindu state. And in fact, the reason why there is a partition at all is because of pressure due to the Muslim League wanting their own state where Muslims would be a majority, as Muslims in the British Raj made up around a quarter of the population, whilst Hindus made up just under 3/4 of the population. Together then, Hindus and Muslims made up around 97% of the people living in the British Raj in 1947. Part of that remaining 3% were the Sikhs, one of the larger of the religious minorities in India at the time, and the question is sometimes asked, how come that both the Hindus got the state of India, the Muslims got the states of East and West Pakistan, but why didn't the Sikhs get their own state as well? And that's what I'd like to talk about in this video. What was the role, the position of the Sikhs during the partition, and why didn't we see a state like Sikhistan or Khalistan appearing when we did see Pakistan and India appearing at the same time? For almost exactly a century, the Indian subcontinent, or most parts of it, were ruled over by the British East India Company, before in 1858 being absorbed into the British Empire and becoming part of an entity called the British Raj. Now during this time, the Sikhs were actually seen by the British as being one and the same as the Hindus and were ruled in the same way as the Hindus, bearing in mind that the British ruled over their colonial subjects based on the religion that they had, thus often creating divisions between these groups that might not always have been there beforehand. In fact, at the time they ruled over the Hindus and the Sikhs in the same way as the Buddhists and the Jains, who they all saw as being part of that Hindu umbrella. What's interesting is that the Sikh religion is formed in the late 15th century with Guru Nanak's teachings and then the other gurus after him, but most of the disciples of early Sikhism were in fact Hindus as well as a few Muslims, which is why Hindus and Sikhs share many beliefs and customs. For example, both Hindus and Sikhs cremate their dead. They both believe in a system of death and rebirth and samsara. They also have the concepts of dharma, karma and moksha. That is to say, they are very ethically duty-based, as well as believing in an idea of enlightenment to escape this cycle. Sikhs also often had to fight against various Mughal emperors, and one of the gurus was actually killed by the Mughals in 1606 for refusing to convert to Islam. This often put them on the same side of the battlefield with various rebelling Hindu princes, thus further forging a relationship between the two religions. Now, the Sikh kingdom or empire was in fact incorporated and defeated by the British in the 19th century in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, but even following this time, the Sikhs were always employed heavily by the British to fight in their armed forces, as the Sikhs were renowned as great warriors already from the early days of their religion. Now, to go back to the 20th century and the partition of India, this is important background information for understanding why there wasn't a Sikh state. Now, one of the reasons for this is a fact of numbers and demographics, because the Sikhs weren't a majority in any one area in India. Even in the Punjab, in the time period, they didn't make up a majority. So if you look back at the census of 1941 for the Punjab, you'll find that the Muslims actually made up the majority there with 53.2%, Hindus made up 29.1%, and Sikhs made up 14.9% of the total population. And in fact, only in one of the districts inside the province of Punjab did the Sikhs make up a majority of around 60%. So again, not that much, especially compared to some areas which were very strongly Muslim majority or very strongly Hindu majority in the subcontinent. Now, another reason for the fact that the Sikhs didn't push for their own independence is because of this connection historically with the Hindus. Now, the Sikhs were very actively involved in the Indian movement for independence, which was largely alongside other Hindu activists. That's not to say that Muslims didn't also fight for India's independence, but they largely backed the Muslim League, which during the Second World War decided to back the British war effort, which is in stark contrast to the Congress, which did not back the British war effort and continued to protest against them. So this also creates a bit of a divide in the camp between Muslims on the one hand and more of the Sikhs and Hindus on the other. Instead of aiming for independence, most Sikh leaders advocating for independence from the British actually wanted no partition to occur at all, and that India would be a secular or a Hindu-led country which would care for the rights of minority religions like the Sikhs and the Muslims as well. Of course, eventually this didn't occur and the country was split, but there is also another important factor, which is that technically the country wasn't being split on religious grounds. Even though that is ultimately what happened, it was being split into various zones so that there would be a majority Muslim country and a majority Hindu country. Some earlier forms of the split had entire enclaves of Muslim-ruled states in what is today India, also joining some kind of federation with Pakistan, but ultimately that didn't happen. Now, of course, adding in a Sikh state into that would have complicated the matter even more, not to mention the fact that the Sikhs weren't actually a majority in this state, so it wouldn't have actually created a majority state for the Sikhs. It would just be another state added on. And what actually ended up happening in the Punjab also happened in Bengal and in Assam, that they were split between the new countries of West or East Pakistan and India. So the Sikhs in the end didn't get an independent state, although what's interesting is the idea put forward by the Sikh historian Harjot Singh Oberoi. Now, he is a little bit controversial, and I'm going to put this in the video because I think it's an interesting theory, but he states that for the Sikhs, Punjab didn't actually have a strong religious significance until the 1930s, that up until that point Sikhism hadn't been tied to one particular area, as for example Islam is certainly tied with the area around Mecca or Medina, but that for the Sikhs, Punjab only started becoming an important spiritual homeland in the 1930s and a little bit later, and that by 1947 this idea wasn't strong enough and wasn't being advocated for as a sort of spiritual Sikh homeland as was being done in other parts of India. That is to say that there were lots of Sikhs living throughout other parts of India, although they were certainly most concentrated in this Punjab region. It's also true that many of the Sikhs living in East Punjab, which is the part that went to India, came there after they fled Pakistan, where many of them were expelled or chose to leave, and many others from India also moved into Punjab. So Punjab, as it is now in India, is indeed a majority Sikh state, but this wasn't the case back in 1947, and there is now a great deal more attachment to Punjab because so many more Sikhs have moved there, whereas this might not have been so strong in 1947 and therefore didn't result in Sikhs advocating for an independent Sikh state as opposed to being incorporated into a secular Indian state. Now, of course, later on we will see Sikh separatism occurring, but this really only starts to emerge properly in the 1970s when you also get Sikh militancy and armed uprisings like at the Golden Temple and calls for an independent Sikh state called Khalistan mostly, and sometimes called Sikhistan as well. But that is for another video. Do let me know if you enjoyed this video and if you knew about this topic beforehand. I knew very little about it, and perhaps I should have known a lot more about it because the Partition of India is such a monumentous event, not only for the people living there but also for the many millions who ended up fleeing the subcontinent and moving elsewhere. So I thought it would be an interesting video to make on this anniversary about an aspect that isn't often talked about, because we know obviously about Pakistan and India being for, well, they're not exactly for the Muslims and for the Hindus, but that is sort of how it has transitioned transpired, but we don't really hear that much about the Sikhs, who in many ways were caught in between both of them and didn't end up with their own state at the end of it. Do let me know if you want to find out more about these topics in the comments below, and check out my other videos on similar topics if you enjoy. Please do also hit the notification bell, because YouTube no longer shows you your subscriptions in the subscription box, whereas if you hit that notification bell, you'll get a little alert when I upload a video. So if you want to watch more of my videos, please do hit that notification bell, give me a thumbs up and a comment, because that really helps me in the algorithm. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, everyone. Do take care, and see you all very soon.